Okay, I'm going to talk about victimization. So I was reading Gulag Archipelago when I was on sabbatical in London a couple of years ago. I should have read it when it came out. I didn't. And what struck me as an old person reading that book was the cruelty of Russians to each other. It was not only the camp guards being awful to the prisoners, it was the prisoners being awful to each other. It was people.
They say that war is hell, but what if I told you that the true hell isn't found on the battlefield when the guns are firing? It is found in how human beings treat one another after the smoke clears. Have you ever wondered why some nations manage to heal after their bloodiest conflicts, while others spiral into a cycle of brutality where the citizens themselves become the jailers of their own neighbors? Today, we are not looking at cold statistics. We are going to peel back the layers of a brutal truth that few dare to discuss: the terrifying difference between the aftermath of the US Civil War and the Russian Gulag system. This is an autopsy of a national psyche. To understand the past, we must look at the present. When we observe the current conflict, a difficult question arises. Why do many Russians, even those living across Europe, seem hesitant to see Russia lose? It is not necessarily because of a blind devotion to leadership or propaganda. It is often a deep-seated psychological defense. As historian Sally Paine observes, it is incredibly difficult for people to own up to the destruction they have caused. Imagine being told that you trashed a neighboring country and now you owe them everything. For a population that may already be struggling, that is a reality too painful to accept. This is a fundamental human trait. We prefer to blame others rather than look at ourselves. We see this in the West as well. In the United States and Europe, it is often easier to blame immigrants or foreign alliances for our struggles rather than facing our own internal failures, such as tax codes or infrastructure funding. We externalize the pain because we do not want to look in the mirror. But in Russia, that mirror reflects a history that is even more harrowing. When we look back at the Soviet era through works like the Gulag Archipelago, we uncover a shocking reality. The true horror wasn't just the cruelty of the camp guards toward the prisoners, it was the cruelty of Russians toward each other. A prison system that vast, spanning an entire nation, only functions because people at all levels make it work. It was neighbors turning on neighbors. It was people working on the trains who treated the deportees with utter callousness. It was family members betraying one another. Even inside the camps, prisoners inflicted incredible cruelties upon fellow prisoners. This wasn't just a government oppressing its people, it was a society where people were willing to inflict pain on their own countrymen. Why does this happen? How does a society reach a point where the cruelty becomes so pervasive? And how does this compare to the United States, a country that also endured the horrors of slavery and a civil war where more Americans died than in all other wars combined? The answer lies in what happens when the war ends, in how the winners treat the losers. That is the brutal difference no one talks about, and that is exactly what we need to uncover next. To understand the depth of the Russian tragedy, we must look at a counterexample, a moment in history where a nation stood on the precipice of total vengeance but chose a different path. Let's turn our gaze to the United States. We cannot speak of American history without acknowledging the unbelievable cruelty of slavery, a system where human beings were subjected to horrors that defy imagination. The legacy of that institution remains with us today, creating profoundly different outcomes depending on which side of that history a family stood. When the American Civil War finally erupted, it was a cataclysm. More Americans died in that conflict than in the totality of all other American wars combined. The bloodshed was immense, the hatred was visceral, and the country was torn in half. By all historical logic, the end of such a war should have triggered a bloodbath. The victors should have decimated the vanquished. But in 1865, something extraordinary happened. Picture the scene at Appomattox. General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army, surrenders. He has led a rebellion that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. In many other places and times, this would be the moment for mass executions. Instead, he simply trades in his sword. The payback for his treason was symbolic rather than physical. His plantation was confiscated and turned into what we now know as Arlington National Cemetery. The message was clear. This is what you did, buddy. It's a big cemetery now. But beyond the property seizure, there was no mass slaughter. There was no bloodbath in the South against white Southerners. The soldiers were allowed to return home. The Union did not unleash a campaign of terror against the populations that had supported the rebellion. The list of those executed was incredibly short. It included the assassins of Abraham Lincoln, and even there, the guilt of some, like the female tavern owner, remains debated. The only other notable execution was the commandant of Andersonville, a massive prison camp where appalling conditions led to the deaths of countless Union soldiers. That was it. A handful of people paid the ultimate price for a war that killed nearly 1 million. Now, contrast this restraint with the Russian Civil War. In Russia, the concept of mercy was non-existent. When the White Army entered a village, they didn't just occupy it, they butchered the Reds. And when the tide turned and the Red Army retook that village, they didn't bring justice. They butchered the Whites. It was a pendulum of absolute destruction. There was no Appomattox moment for Russia. There was no trading in of swords. There was only a cycle of retribution where the winning side sought to annihilate the losing side entirely. This fundamental difference in how a society handles the end of conflict, whether they choose integration or extermination, sowed the seeds for the Gulag system that would follow. If the American Civil War ended with a cemetery and a surrender, the Russian Civil War ended with a template for total eradication. But to truly understand why the Russian worldview evolved so differently, we have to look beyond the battlefield and into the village. In the Russian conflict, there was no neutral ground. As the history shows, when the White Army occupied a village, they didn't just defeat the Red Army, they butchered them. And when the pendulum swung back and the Reds took that same village, the retribution was identical. They butchered the Whites. This wasn't just war. It was a cycle of absolute purification where the enemy was not a political opponent, but a contagion to be wiped out. This mentality did not disappear when the treaties were signed. It metastasized. It transformed from a military strategy into a governing philosophy, eventually birthing the Gulag system. And this is where the hard truth becomes most difficult to swallow. We often picture the Gulag as a system imposed strictly from the top down, a tyrant forcing a population into submission. But the reality, as captured in the historical analysis of the era, is far more disturbing. A nationwide system of camps, prisons, and forced labor cannot exist solely because of one dictator or a secret police force. It requires a massive, functioning infrastructure of complicity. As Sally Paine notes, the only way you get a Gulag system that operates on a national scale is because you have people across the entire nation making it work. It requires farmers to sell food to the camps. It requires engineers to maintain the trains that transport the prisoners. It requires bureaucrats to file the paperwork and neighbors to look the other way. This is the mind-blowing level of cruelty that Solzhenitsyn described. It wasn't just the guards in the watchtowers. It was the people along the way, the citizens who treated the prisoners on the trains with contempt, the family members who turned on each other, and the neighbors who were awful to those who returned. The cruelty was decentralized. It became a part of the daily fabric of life, where survival meant participating, however passively, in the suffering of others. In the American example, despite the deep scars of slavery and war, the society did not devolve into a permanent state of internal purge, where the winning side systematically hunted the losing side for decades. In Russia, however, that internal war never really ended. It just changed shape. And this leads us to the most critical psychological question: how does a society live with this? How do you wake up every day knowing you are part of this machine? The answer brings us back to that persistent sense of victimhood, the psychological shield that allows a nation to avoid looking in the mirror. How does a society survive when the line between the oppressor and the oppressed becomes so blurred? When the person reporting you is your neighbor and the person you are reporting is your colleague? The answer lies in a profound psychological defense mechanism, the absolute refusal to accept blame. This is where the concept of victimhood transforms from a complaint into a national shield. As we analyze the current geopolitical landscape, we see a confusing phenomenon. Even Russians living in the West, people with access to free information, far removed from the Kremlin's direct control, often struggle to accept the idea of a Russian defeat. Why? Is it simple nationalism? Not entirely. As noted in our analysis, it is because the alternative is psychologically unbearable. To accept defeat is to accept responsibility. It means looking at the destruction of Ukraine and admitting We did this. We owe them. For a population that has historically suffered immense poverty and internal trauma, the idea of owing reparations, of paying for the damage caused to others, is a bridge too far. It is much easier and much safer to retreat into the narrative that you are the one being attacked. This is why the narrative of victimization is so potent in Russia. It is not just a tool used by leadership. It is a survival raft for the population. If you are the victim, you cannot be the perpetrator. If the world is against you, then your cruelty is just self-defense. To be fair, this tendency to externalize blame is universally human. We see it in the United States and Europe constantly. When economies tighten, we don't look at complex structural issues like tax codes or infrastructure spending. We look for scapegoats. We blame immigrants. We blame foreign alliances. We say, they are dragging us down. It is a universal human flaw to avoid looking in the mirror. But in the Russian context, this externalization is not just about policy. It is about history. When a society has spent decades in a system where cruelty was the currency of survival, where you had to harden your heart against your neighbor to survive, the Gulag era owning up to that past becomes impossible. You cannot admit that the call coming from inside the house is your own. So, you build a fortress of victimhood. You convince yourself that the aggression is coming from the outside, that the West is the enemy, and that your actions, no matter how brutal, are justified. This refusal to own up, as Sally Paine puts it, is the barrier that prevents the cycle from breaking, and it stands in stark contrast to the painful, imperfect, but necessary process of reconciliation that other nations have attempted. To fully grasp the Russian worldview, we must navigate a difficult intellectual landscape. It is easy to point fingers and say one nation is cruel while another is virtuous, but history is rarely that simple. As we analyze the pathology of the Russian state, we must also confront the counterexample that historian Sally Paine highlights: the United States and its own history of profound cruelty. We cannot have this conversation without addressing the elephant in the room: slavery. The United States was built on an institution of unbelievable cruelty. To enslave other human beings is an atrocity that leaves scars lasting for centuries, creating profoundly different outcomes for people depending on whether their ancestors were enslaved or free. If we are measuring cruelty by the capacity to inflict pain on fellow humans, the American record is undeniably dark. However, there is a critical distinction in how that cruelty evolved when the internal conflict finally exploded. The American Civil War was a bloodbath, a collision that killed more Americans than all other wars combined. Yet, when the dust settled, the nation did not devolve into a permanent state of hunting down the enemy within. Consider the aftermath. The Union won. They had the power to eradicate the Confederate leadership, to burn every village that supported the rebellion, and to execute every officer who fired on the flag. But they didn't. General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and while he lost his estate, which became Arlington National Cemetery, he was not dragged to a firing squad. The soldiers went home. The only people executed were the assassins of Lincoln and the commandant of Andersonville, the man responsible for a prison camp that was practically a death sentence. Now, compare this to the Russian experience. In the Russian Civil War, cruelty was not just a tool of the state. It was a pendulum of total annihilation. When the White Army occupied a village, they didn't just govern it, they butchered the Reds. When the Red Army returned, they didn't just liberate it, they butchered the Whites. It was a war of extermination, where the objective was not surrender, but erasure. This is the divergence point. The United States had institutional cruelty, slavery, but it rejected retributive slaughter as a mechanism of reunification. Russia, conversely, adopted retribution as its primary method of governance. This normalized a culture where the enemy is never truly gone. They are just waiting for their turn to butcher you. This fear that the loser will be annihilated drives the refusal to ever lose, to ever apologize, or to ever admit fault. Because in the Russian historical memory, to lose isn't just to surrender your sword, it is to lose your existence. And this brings us to the most tragic consequence of all, the impossibility of returning home. In the American narrative, despite the bitterness and the immense loss of life, there was a fundamental concept of amnesty. The soldiers of the Confederacy, who had fought to destroy the Union were not lined up and shot en masse. They were told to lay down their arms and go back to their farms. They were allowed to reintegrate, however painfully, into the fabric of the nation. The punishment was severe in terms of loss of power and property, but it stopped short of eradication. The victors chose a path that allowed the vanquished to exist. In the Russian experience, as described in the historical analysis, there was no home to return to, because the village you left might now be occupied by those who wanted you dead. The Red Terror and the White Terror didn't just kill soldiers, they killed the very idea of a neighbor. When the standard operating procedure is to butcher the opposition when you take a village, you destroy the possibility of a shared future. You create a society where trust is a liability and paranoia is a virtue. This historical trauma explains the modern Russian reflex that is observed today. Why is it so hard for Russians to say, "We messed up"? Why is it so hard to look at the devastation in Ukraine and own it? Because in their historical DNA, admitting guilt doesn't lead to forgiveness. It leads to the Gulag. It leads to the purge. If the only two options a society has ever known are dominate or be destroyed, then the population will defend its actions at all costs, even when the moral weight of those actions is crushing. You cannot afford to be wrong, because in this worldview, to be wrong is to be finished. This creates a psychological trap where the population is unable to hold its leadership accountable because the fear of what comes after the fear of being on the losing side of history again is far greater than the shame of the current actions. This is the invisible wall that stands between Russia and the rest of Europe, a wall built not of bricks, but of a centuries-old fear of retribution. This brings us to the ultimate tragedy of this worldview. It is not just that it traps the nation in the past, it ensures that the suffering is self-perpetuating. When we analyze the historical accounts from the Gulag era, the most striking realization is not the oppression from above, but the betrayal from beside. It was the prisoners stealing from prisoners. It was the total breakdown of social solidarity. In a society where your neighbor is a potential threat, you cannot build the institutions of freedom. You cannot have a functioning democracy if you do not trust the person standing next to you. This is the missing link that explains why, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia did not transition into a peaceful partner in Europe, but instead slid back into authoritarianism. The flags changed, the statues of Lenin came down, but the underlying software, the fear, the distrust, and the habit of cruelty remained installed in the hardware of society. Because the nation never had its Appomattox moment, that moment of laying down the sword and accepting a shared peace, the war effectively never ended. It just went underground. The state remained the only protector because the community had been destroyed. In the American South, after the Civil War, despite the bitterness, there was still a community structure that allowed people to rebuild their lives independent of the federal government. In the Russian experience, the community itself was the weapon used against the individual. Therefore, when a strongman arises and promises order, promises to protect the nation from external enemies, the population clings to him. Not necessarily out of love, but because the alternative relying on each other has been historically proven to be fatal. They support the narrative of a besieged fortress because inside the fortress, at least they know the rules. Outside, in the chaotic world of accountability and democracy, they see only danger. This is why the worldview persists. It is a survival mechanism forged in fire and blood, where the price of trust was death and the price of survival was silence. So, what is the ultimate lesson hidden behind Russia's worldview? What is the stranger thing that Sally Paine wants us to see? It is this: the most dangerous moment for any nation is not when it goes to war, but when it decides how to end it. The divergence between the United States and Russia teaches us a brutal truth about human nature. The United States, for all its flaws and its horrific history of slavery, managed to survive its greatest apocalypse because it chose an imperfect peace over a perfect purge. It accepted that in order to have a future, the winners had to let the losers go home. They had to swallow the bitterness of seeing former enemies walk free because the alternative, a cycle of eternal retribution, was a price too high to pay. The Appomattox moment was not just a military surrender, it was a spiritual decision to stop the wheel of violence. Russia, conversely, shows us the terrifying cost of the other path. It shows us what happens when a society prioritizes ideological purity over human solidarity. By refusing to end the civil war, by turning the mechanism of the state into a weapon of permanent vengeance, Russia destroyed its own immune system. It created a world where owning up to mistakes is suicidal, where victimhood is the only safe harbor, and where cruelty is normalized as a necessary tool of statecraft. The tragedy of modern Russia is not just about one man in the Kremlin. It is about a century-old wound that was never allowed to heal, kept open by a refusal to look in the mirror. As we watch the current conflict unfold, we are witnessing the echoes of that unresolved past. The fear of losing today is amplified by the ancestral memory of what happens to losers in the Russian system. But this is not just a lesson about Russia. It is a warning to all of us. In an era of increasing polarization, where we are tempted to view our political opponents not as neighbors who disagree, but as enemies who must be destroyed, the Russian example stands as a grim monument. It reminds us that a society that cannot forgive its own members, that cannot find a way to reintegrate those it disagrees with, is a society that is slowly digging its own grave. The stranger behind the worldview is simply the ghost of a war that never ended. And until a nation finds the courage to stop the cycle, to own up to its cruelty, and to choose the painful path of reconciliation, the history will not just be remembered, it will be repeated. Thank you for watching, and may we all find the wisdom to choose the path of the cemetery at Arlington, rather than the silence of the Gulag.